Chapter 2 UFOs in Dreams. Not only are UFOs seen, they are of course also dreamt about. This is particularly interesting to the psychologist, because the dreams tell us in what sense they are understood by the unconscious. In order to form anything like a complete picture of an object reflected in the psyche, far more than an exclusively intellectual operation is required. In addition to the three other functions of feeling, valuation, sensation, reality sense, and intuition, perception of possibilities, we need the reaction of the unconscious, i.e. the picture of the unconscious associative context. It is this total view that alone makes possible a whole judgment on the psychic situation constellated by the object. An exclusively intellectual approach is bound to be from 50 to 75% unsatisfactory. By way of illustration, I shall recite 2 dreams dreamt by an educated lady. She had never seen a UFO but was interested in the phenomenon without being able to form a definite picture of it. She did not know the UFO literature, nor was she acquainted with my ideas on the subject. Dream 1. She writes, I was going down the Champs-Élysées in a bus with many other people. Suddenly, the air raid warning sounded. The bus stopped and all the passengers jumped out, and the next moment they had disappeared into the nearest houses, banging the doors behind them. I was the last to leave the bus. I tried to get into a house, but all the doors with their polished brass knobs were tightly shut, and the whole Champs-Élysées was empty. I pressed against the wall of a house and looked up at the sky. Instead of the expected bombers, I saw a sort of flying saucer, a metallic sphere shaped like a drop. It was flying along quite slowly from north to east, and I had the impression that I was being observed. In the silence, I heard the high heels of a woman who was walking alone on the empty sidewalk down the Champs-Élysées. The atmosphere was most uncanny. Dream 2, about a month later. She writes, I was walking at night in the streets of a city. Interplanetary machines appeared in the sky and everyone fled. The machines looked like large steel cigars. I did not flee. One of the machines spotted me and came straight towards me at an oblique angle. I think Professor Jung says that one should not run away, so I stand still and look at the machine. From the front, seen close to, it looked like a circular eye, half blue, half white. A room in a hospital. My 2 chiefs come in, very worried, and ask my sister how it is going. My sister replied that the mere sight of the machine had burnt my whole face. Only then did I realize that they were talking about me, and that my whole head was bandaged, although I could not see it. Commentary to Dream 1. The dream describes as the exposition of the initial situation a mass panic as at an air raid warning. A UFO appears having the form of a drop. A fluid body assumes the form of a drop when it is about to fall, from which it is clear that the UFO is conceived as a liquid falling from the sky like rain. This surprising drop form of the UFO and the analogy with the fluid occur in the literature. Presumably it is meant to express the commonly reported changeability of the UFO's shape. This heavenly fluid must be of a mysterious nature and is probably a conception similar to that of the alchemical aqua permanens, the permanent water, which was also called heaven in 16th century alchemy and stood for the quinta essentia. This water is the deus ex machina of alchemy, the wonderful solvent, the word solutio being used equally for a chemical solution and for the solution of a problem. Indeed, it is the great magician Mercurius himself, the dissolver and binder, solve et coagula, the physical and spiritual panacea, which at the time can be something threatening and dangerous, and falls as the aqua celestalis from heaven. Just as the alchemists speak of their stone which is no stone, so also of their philosophical water which is no water, but quicksilver, and no ordinary Hg at that, but a spirit, pneuma. It represents the arcane substance which, during the alchemical operations, changes from a base metal into a spiritual form, often personified as the Filius Hermaphroditus, Filius Macrocosmi, etc. The water of the philosophers is the classic substance that transmutes the chemical elements and during their transformation is itself transformed. It is also the redeeming spirit. These ideas began far back in the literature of antiquity, underwent further development during the Middle Ages, and even penetrated into folklore and fairy tale. A very ancient text, possibly 1st century AD, says that in the stone that is found in the Nile there is a spirit. For a period of nearly 1700 years, we have ample testimonies of the effectiveness of this animistic archetype. Mercurius is on the one hand a metal, on the other a fluid that can easily be volatilized, i.e. changed into vapor or spirit. This was known as Spiritus Mercurii and was regarded as a kind of panacea, savior, and servator mundi, preserver of the world. Mercurius is a bringer of healing, who makes peace between enemies, and as the food of immortality. He saves creation from sickness and corruption, just as Christ saved mankind. In the language of the Church Fathers, Christ is a springing fountain, and in the same way the alchemists call Mercurius aqua permanens, vinum ardens, fiery wine, mare nostrum, our sea, sanguis, blood, etc. From many of the reports, particularly the early ones, it is evident that the UFOs can appear suddenly and vanish equally suddenly. They can be tracked by radar but remain invisible to the eye, and conversely can be seen by the eye but not detected by radar. UFOs can make themselves invisible at will, it is said, and must obviously consist of a substance that is visible at one moment and invisible at the next. The nearest analogy to this is a volatile liquid which condenses out of an invisible state into the forms of a drop. In reading the old text, one can still feel the miracle of disappearance and reappearance which the alchemists beheld in the vaporization of water or quicksilver. For them it was the transformation of the souls that had become water, Heraclitus, into the invisible pneuma at the touch of Hermes' wand, and their descent out of the Empyrean into visible form again. Zosimos of Panopolis, 3rd century AD, has left us a valuable document describing this transformation, which takes place in a cooking vessel. The fantasies born of musings over the steaming cooking pot, one of the most ancient experiences of mankind, may also be responsible for the sudden disappearance and reappearance of the UFO. The unexpected drop form in our dream has prompted a comparison with a central conception of alchemy known to us not only from Europe but also from India and 2nd century China. The extraordinariness of the UFOs is paralleled by the extraordinariness of the psychological context, which has to be adduced if we are to risk any interpretation at all. Considering the essential weirdness of the UFO phenomenon, we cannot expect the familiar rationalistic principles of explanation to be in any way adequate. A psychoanalytic approach to the problem could do nothing more than turn on the whole idea of UFOs into a sexual fantasy, at most arriving at the conclusion that a repressed uterus was coming down from the sky. This would not fit in too badly with the old medical view of hysteria, as a wandering of the uterus, especially in the case of a woman who had an anxiety dream. But then, what about the masculine pilots who are the chief authors of the rumor? The language of sex is hardly more significant than any other symbolic means of expression. This type of explanation is, at bottom, just as mythological and rationalistic as the technological fables about the nature and purpose of UFOs. The dreamer knew enough about psychology to realize in her second dream the necessity of not giving in to her fear and running away, as she would dearly have liked to do. But the unconscious created a situation in which this way out was barred. Consequently, she had an opportunity to observe the phenomenon at close quarters, It proved to be harmless. Indeed, the untroubled footsteps of a woman point to someone who is either not aware of it at all or is free from fear. Commentary to Dream 2. The exposition begins with the statement that it is night and dark, a time when normally everyone is asleep and dreaming. As in the previous dream, panic breaks out. A number of UFOs appear. Recalling the first commentary, we could say that the unity of the self as a supraordinate semi-divine figure has broken up into a plurality. On a mythological level, this would correspond to a plurality of gods, god-men, demons, or souls. In Hermetic philosophy, the arcane substance has 1,000 names. But essentially, it consists of the one and only, i.e. God, and this principle only becomes pluralized through being split up, multiplicatio. The alchemists were consciously performing an opus divinum in that they sought to free the soul in chains, i.e. to release the demiurge distributed and imprisoned in his own creation, and restore him to his original condition of unity. Looked at psychologically, the plurality of the symbol of unity signifies a splitting into many independent units, into a number of selves. The one metaphysical principle, representing the idea of monotheism, is dissolved into a plurality of subordinate deities. From the standpoint of Christian dogma, such an operation could easily be construed as arch-heresy, were it not that this view is contradicted by the unequivocal saying of Christ, "Ye are gods," and by the equally emphatic idea that we are all God's children, both of which presuppose man at least potential kinship with God. From the psychological point of view, however, the plurality of UFOs would correspond to the projection of a plurality of human individuals, the choice of symbol, spherical object, indicating that the content of the projection is not the actual people themselves, but rather the ideal psychic totality, not the empirical man as he knows himself to be from experience, but his whole psyche, the conscious contents of which have still to be supplemented by the contents of the unconscious. Although we know from our investigations a number of things about the unconscious which give us some clue as to its nature, we are still very far from being able to sketch out even a hypothetical picture that is in any way adequate. To mention only one of the greatest difficulties, there are parapsychological experiences which can no longer be denied and have to be taken into account in evaluating psychic processes. The unconscious can no longer be treated as if it were causally dependent on consciousness, since it possesses qualities which are not under conscious control. It should rather be understood as an autonomous entity acting reciprocally with consciousness. The plurality of UFOs, then, is a projection of a number of psychic images of wholeness, which appear in the sky because, on the one hand, they represent archetypes charged with energy, and on the other hand are not recognized as psychic factors. The reason for this is that our present-day consciousness possesses no conceptual categories by means of which it could apprehend the nature of psychic totality. It is still an archaic state, so to speak, in which apperceptions of this kind do not occur, and accordingly the relevant contents cannot be recognized as psychic factors. Moreover, it is so trained that it must think of such images not as forms inherent in the psyche, but as existing somewhere in extra-psychic metaphysical space, or else as historical facts. When, therefore, the archetype receives from the conditions of the time and from the general psychic situation an additional charge of energy, it cannot, for the reasons I have described, be integrated directly into consciousness, but is forced to manifest itself in the form of spontaneous projections. The projected image, then, appears as an ostensibly physical fact independent of the individual psyche and its nature. In other words, the rounded wholeness of the mandala becomes a spaceship controlled by an intelligent being. The usually lens-shaped form of the UFOs may be helped by the fact that psychic wholeness, as the historical testimonies show, has always been characterized by certain cosmic affinities. The individual soul was thought to be of heavenly origin, a particle of the world soul, and hence a microcosm, a reflection of the macrocosm. Leibniz's monadology is an eloquent example of this. The macrocosm is the starry world around us, which, appearing to the naive mind as spherical, gives the soul its traditional spherical form. Actually, the astronomical heavens are filled with mainly lens-shaped agglomerations of stars, the galaxies, similar in form to that of the UFOs. This form may possibly be a concession to the recent astronomical findings, for to my knowledge there are no older traditions that speak of the soul having the form of a lens. Here, we may have an instance of an older tradition being modified by recent additions to knowledge, an influencing of primordial ideas by the latest acquisitions of consciousness, like the frequent substitution of automobiles and airplanes for animals and monsters in modern dreams. It must be emphasized, however, that there is also the possibility of a natural or absolute knowledge, where the unconscious psyche coincides with objective facts. This is a problem that has been raised by the discoveries of parapsychology. Absolute knowledge occurs not only in telepathy and precognition, but also in biology, for instance in the attunement of the virus of hydrophobia to the anatomy of dog and man as described by Portman. The wasp's apparent knowledge of where the motor ganglia are located in the caterpillar, that is to nourish the wasp's progeny, the emission of light by certain fishes and insects with almost 100% efficiency, the directional sense of carrier pigeons, the warning of earthquakes given by chickens and cats, and the amazing cooperation found in symbiotic relationships. We know, too, that the life processes itself cannot be explained only by causality, but requires intelligent choice. The shape of the UFOs is, in this sense, analogous to that of the elements composing the structure of space, the galaxies, no matter how ridiculous this seems to human reason. In our dream, the usual lens-shaped form is replaced by the rarer cigar form, derived apparently from the old dirigible airships. As in Dream 1, a psychoanalytic approach could resort to a female symbol, the uterus, to explain the drop. So here the sexual analogy of the phallic form leaps to the eye. The archaic background of the psyche has this much in common with primitive language, that they both translate unknown or incompletely understood things into instinctive and habitual forms of thought, so that Freud could, with some justification, establish that all round or hollow forms have a feminine and all oblong ones a masculine meaning, as for instance nuts and bolts, male and female pipe joints, etc. In these cases, the interest that naturally attaches to sex stimulates the making of such analogies, not to speak of the amusing illustrations they provide. Still, sex is not the sole instigator of these metaphors. There is also hunger, the urge to eat and drink. In the history of religion, they are not only sexual unions with the gods, they are also eaten and drunk. Even sexual attraction has become the object of these metaphors. We like a girl so much that we could eat her. Language is full of metaphors which express one instinct in terms of another, but we need not conclude from this that the real and essential thing is always love or hunger or the urge to power, etc. The main point is that every situation activates the relevant instinct, which then dominates as a vital need and decides the choice of symbol as well as its interpretation. Very probably, there is a phallic analogy in the dream, which, in accordance with the meaning of this exceedingly archaic symbol, gives the UFO the character of something procreative, fructifying, and in the broadest sense, penetrating. In ancient times, the feeling of being penetrated by, or of receiving, the god was allegorized by the sexual act. But it would be a gross misunderstanding to interpret a genuine religious experience as a repressed sexual fantasy on account of a mere metaphor. The penetration can also be expressed by a sword, spear, or arrow. The dreamer does not flee from the menacing aspect of the UFO, even when she sees it coming straight at her. During this confrontation, the original spherical or lens-shaped aspect reappears in the form of a circular eye. This image corresponds to the traditional eye of God, which, all-seeing, searches the hearts of men, laying bare the truth and pitilessly exposing every cranny of the soul. It is a reflection of one's insight into the total reality of one's own being. The eye is half blue, half white. This corresponds to the colors of the sky. It's pure blue and the whiteness of clouds that obscure its transparency. The psychic totality, the self, is a combination of opposites. Without a shadow, even the self is not real. It always has two aspects, a bright and a dark, like the pre-Christian idea of God in the Old Testament, which is so much better suited to the facts of religious experience. That the summum bonum, based as this is on the precarious foundation of a mere syllogism, the privatio boni. Even the highly Christian Jacob Boehme could not escape this insight and gave eloquent expression to it in his 40 Questions Concerning the Soul. The drop-shaped UFO, suggesting a liquid substance, a sort of water, makes way for a circular structure which not only sees, i.e. emits light, according to the old view light is equivalent to seeing, but also sends out a scorching heat. One immediately thinks of the intolerable radiance that shone from the face of Moses after he had seen God, of "Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings?" and of the saying of Jesus, "He who is near unto me is near unto fire." Nowadays, people who have an experience of this kind are more likely to go running to the doctor or psychiatrist than to the theologian. I have more than once been consulted by people who were terrified by their dreams and visions. They took them for symptoms of mental illness, possibly heralding insanity, whereas in reality they were dreams sent by God, real and genuine religious experiences that collided with a mind unprepared, ignorant, and profoundly prejudiced. In this matter, there is little choice today. Anything out of the ordinary can only be pathological. For that abstraction, the statistical average, counts as the ultimate truth, and not reality. All feeling for value is repressed in the interests of a narrow intellect and his biased reason. So it is no wonder that after her UFO experience our patient woke up in hospital with a burning face. This is only to be expected today. The second dream differs from the first in that it brings out the dreamer's inner relationship to the UFO. The UFO has marked her out and not only turns a searching eye upon her, but irradiates her with a magical heat, a synonym for her own inner affectivity. Fire is the symbolic equivalent of a very strong emotion or affect, which in this case comes upon her quite unexpectedly. In spite of her justifiable fear of the UFO, she held her ground, as though it were intrinsically harmless, but is now made to realize that it is capable of sending out a deadly heat, a statement we often meet with in the UFO literature. This heat is a projection of her own unrealized emotion, that is, of a feeling that has intensified into an effect, but remains unrecognized. Even her facial expression was altered, burnt by it. This recalls not only the changed face of Moses, but also that of Brother Klaus, after his terrifying vision of God. It points to an indelible experience whose traces remain visible to others because it has brought about a demonstrable change in the entire personality. Psychologically, of course, such an event betokens only a potential change. It has first to be integrated into consciousness. That is why Brother Klaus felt it necessary to spend long years in wearisome study and meditation until he succeeded in recognizing his terrifying vision as a vision of the Holy Trinity, in accordance with the spirit of the age, thus transforming the experience into an integrated conscious content that was intellectually and morally binding for him. This work has still to be done by the dreamer, and perhaps also by all those who see UFOs, dream of them, or spread rumors about them. The symbols of divinity coincide with those of the self. What on the one side appears as a psychological experience signifying psychic wholeness, expresses on the other side the idea of God. This is not to assert a metaphysical identity of the two, but merely the empirical identity of the images representing them, which all originate in the human psyche, as our dream shows. What the metaphysical conditions are for the similarity of the image is, like everything transcendental, beyond human knowledge. The motif of the isolated God's eye, which the unconscious proffers as an interpretation of the UFO, can be found in ancient Egyptian mythology as the Eye of Horus, who with its help healed the partial blinding of his father Osiris caused by Set. The isolated God's eye also appears in Christian iconography. In dealing with the products of the collective unconscious, all images that show an unmistakably mythological character have to be examined in their symbological context. They are the inborn language of the psyche and its structure, and, as regards their basic form, are in no sense individual acquisitions. Despite its capacity for learning and for consciousness, the human psyche is a natural phenomenon like the psyche of animals, and is based on inborn instincts which bring their own specific forms with them, and in this way constitute the heredity of the species. Volition, intention, and all personal differentiations are acquired late, and owe their existence to a consciousness that has emancipated itself from mere instinctivity. Wherever it is a question of archetypal formations, personalistic attempts at explanation lead us astray. The method of comparative symbology, on the other hand, not only proves fruitful on scientific grounds, but makes a deeper understanding possible in practice. The symbological or amplificatory approach produces a result that looks at first like a translation back into a primitive language. And so it would be, if understanding with the help of the unconscious were a purely intellectual affair, and not one that brought our total capacities into play. In other words, besides its formal mode of manifestation, the archetype also possesses a numinous quality, a feeling value that is highly effective in practice. One can be unconscious of this value, since it can be repressed artificially. But a repression has neurotic consequences, because the repressed effect still exists and simply makes an outlet for itself elsewhere, in some unsuitable place. As our dream shows very clearly, the UFO comes from the unconscious background, which has always expressed itself in numinous ideas and images. It is these that give the strange phenomenon an interpretation that makes it appear in a significant light. Significant not merely because they arouse dim historical memories which link up with the findings of comparative psychology, but because actual effective processes are at work. Today, as never before, men pay an extraordinary amount of attention to the skies for technological reasons. This is especially true of the airman, whose field of vision is occupied on the one hand by the complicated control apparatus before him, and on the other by the empty vastness of cosmic space. His consciousness is concentrated one-sidedly on details requiring the most careful observation, while at his back, so to speak, his unconscious strives to fill the illimitable empty space. His training and his common sense both preclude him from observing all the things that might rise up from within and become visible in order to compensate the emptiness and solitude of flight high above the earth. Such a situation provides the ideal conditions for spontaneous psychic phenomena, as everyone knows who has lived sufficiently long in the solitude, silence, and emptiness of deserts, seas, mountains, or in the primeval forests. Rationalism and boredom are essentially products of the overindulged craving for stimulation so characteristic of urban populations. The city dweller seeks artificial sensations to escape his boredom. The hermit does not seek them, but is plagued by them against his will. We know from the life of ascetics and anchorites that whether they would or no, and without any assistance from consciousness, spontaneous psychic phenomena rose up to compensate their biological needs, numinous fantasy images, visions, and hallucinations that were evaluated either positively or negatively. Those positively evaluated derived from a sphere of the unconscious felt to be spiritual, the others obviously from the instinctual world they knew only too well, where loaded dishes and flagons and luscious meals stilled their hunger, seductive and voluptuous beings yielded themselves to their pent-up sexual desires, riches and worldly power took the place of poverty and lack of influence, and bustling crowds, noise, and music enlivened the intolerable silence and loneliness. Although it is easy to speak here of images caused by repressed wishes and explain the projection of fantasies that way, it does not explain the visions that were evaluated positively, because these do not correspond to a repressed wish, but to one that is fully conscious and therefore cannot produce a projection. A psychic content can only appear as a projection when its connection to the ego, personality, is not recognized. For this reason, the wish hypothesis must be discarded. The hermits that sought to attain a spiritual experience, and for this purpose they mortified the earthly man. Naturally enough, the affronted world of instinct reacted with unseemly projections, but the spiritual sphere, too, responded with projections of a positive nature, most unexpectedly to our scientific way of thinking. For the spiritual sphere had not been neglected in any way. On the contrary, it was nurtured with the greatest possible devotion through prayer, meditation, and other spiritual exercises. So, according to our hypothesis, it should have had no need of compensation. Its one-sidedness, which insisted on mortifying the body, was already compensated by the violent reaction on the part of the instincts. Nevertheless, the spontaneous appearance of positive projections, in the form of numinous images, was experienced as grace, and felt to be a divine revelation, and indeed they are characterized as such by the content of the visions. Psychologically speaking, these visions behave in exactly the same way as the visions produced by the neglected instincts, despite the undeniable fact that the saints did everything to foster their spirituality. They did not mortify the spiritual man, and therefore needed no compensation in this respect. If in the face of this dilemma we cling to the proven truth of the compensation theory, we are driven to the paradoxical conclusion that, despite appearances to the contrary, the spiritual situation of the hermit was one of deficiency after all, and that it needed an appropriate compensation. Just as physical hunger is sated, at least metaphorically, by the sight of a marvelous meal, so the hunger of the soul is sated by the vision of numinous images. But it is not so easy to see why the anchorite soul should suffer from hunger. He stakes his whole life on earning the panis supersubstantialis, the super-essential bread, which alone appeases his hunger, and besides that he has the faith, doctrines, and means of grace of the Church at his disposal. Why then should he lack anything? All this he has, but the fact remains that he is not nourished by it, and his unappeasable desire remains unfulfilled. What obviously he still lacks is the actual and immediate experience of spiritual reality, however it may turn out. Whether it presents itself to him more or less concretely or symbolically makes little difference. In any case, he is not expecting the physical tangibility of any earthly thing, but rather the sublime intangibleness of a spiritual vision. This experience is in itself a compensation for the barrenness and emptiness of traditional forms, and accordingly he values it above all else. For in fact there appears before him, uncreated by himself, a numinous image which is just as real and actual, because it acts upon him, as the illusions spun by his neglected instincts. It is, however, as much desired by him on account of its reality and spontaneity as the illusions of his senses are undesired. So long as the numinous contents can avail themselves, in one way or another, of the traditional forms, there is no cause for disquiet. But when they betray their archaism by assuming unusual and obnoxious features, the matter becomes painfully dubious. The saint then begins to doubt whether they are any less illusory than the delusions of the senses. Indeed, it may even happen that a revelation originally regarded as divine is subsequently damned as a deception of the devil. The criterion of distinction is simply and solely tradition, not reality or unreality, as in the case of a real or illusory meal. The vision is a psychic phenomenon, just as are its numinous contents. Here, spirit answers spirit, whereas in a fast, the need for food is answered by an hallucination and not by a real meal. In the first case, the bill is paid in cash. In the second case, by an unbacked check. The one solution is satisfying, the other obviously not. But in both cases, the structure of the phenomenon is the same. Physical hunger needs a real meal, and spiritual hunger needs a numinous content. Such contents are by nature archetypal and have always expressed themselves in the form of natural revelations, for Christian symbolism, like all other religious ideas, is based on archetypal models that go back into prehistory. The total character of these symbols includes every kind of human interest and instinct, thereby guaranteeing the numinosity of the archetype. That is why, in comparative religion, we so often find the religious and spiritual aspects associated with those of sexuality, hunger, aggression, power, etc. A particularly fruitful source of religious symbolism is the instinct to which most importance is attached in a given epoch or culture, or which is of most concern to the individual. There are communities in which hunger is more important than sex and vice versa. Our civilization bothers us less with food taboos than with sexual restrictions. In modern society, these have come to play the role of an injured deity that is getting its own back in every sphere of human activity, including psychology, where it would reduce spirit to sexual repression. However, a partial interpretation of the symbolism in sexual terms should be taken seriously. If the striving for a spiritual goal is not a genuine instinct, but merely the result of a particular social development, then an explanation according to sexual principles is the most appropriate and the most acceptable to reason. But even if we grant the striving for wholeness and unity the character of a genuine instinct, and base our explanation mainly on this principle, the fact still remains that there is a close association between sexual instinct and the longing for wholeness. With the exception of religious longings, nothing challenges modern man more consciously and personally than sex. One can also say in good faith that he is possessed even more by the power instinct. This question will be decided according to temperament and one's own subjective bias. The only thing we cannot doubt is that the most important of the fundamental instincts, the religious instinct for wholeness, plays the least conspicuous part in contemporary consciousness because, as history shows, it can free itself only with the greatest effort and with continual backslidings from contamination with the other two instincts. These can constantly appeal to common everyday facts known to everyone, but the religious instinct requires for its evidence a more highly differentiated consciousness, thoughtfulness, reflection, responsibility, and sundry other virtues. Therefore it does not commend itself to the relatively unconscious man driven by his natural impulses, because, imprisoned in his familiar world, he clings to the commonplace, the obvious, the probable, the collectively valid, using for his motto, "Thinking is difficult, therefore let the herd pronounce judgment." It is an enormous relief to him when something that looks complicated, unusual, puzzling, and problematical can be reduced to something ordinary and banal, especially when the solution strikes him as surprisingly simple and somewhat droll. The most convenient explanations are invariably sex and the power instinct, and reduction to these two dominants gives rationalists and materialists an ill-concealed satisfaction. They have neatly disposed of an intellectually and morally uncomfortable difficulty, and on top of that can enjoy the feeling of having accomplished a useful work of enlightenment, which will free the individual from unnecessary moral and social burdens. In this way they can pose as benefactors of mankind. On closer inspection, however, things look very different. The exemption of the individual from a difficult and apparently insoluble task drives sexuality into an even more pernicious repression, where it is replaced by rationalism or by devastating cynicism, while the power instinct is driven towards some socialistic ideal that has already turned half the world into the state prison of communism. This is the exact opposite of what the striving for wholeness wants, namely, to free the individual from the compulsion of the other two instincts. The task before him comes back with all its energies unused, and reinforces to an almost pathological degree the very instincts that have always stood in the way of man's higher development. At all events, it has a neuroticizing effect characteristic of our time, and must bear most of the blame for the splitting of the individual and of the world in general. We just will not admit the shadow, and so the right hand does not know what the left is doing. Correctly appraising the situation, the Catholic Church, while counting sexual sins among the quote venial ones, therefore keeps a sharp eye upon sexuality as the chief enemy in practice and ferrets it out in all corners. She thus creates an acute consciousness of sex, deleterious to weaker spirits, but of advantage in promoting reflection and broadening the consciousness of the stronger. The worldly pomps of the Catholic Church, for which she is reproached by the Protestants, have the obvious purpose of keeping the power of the spirit visibly before the natural power instinct. This is infinitely more effective than the best logical arguments, which no one likes following. Only the tiniest fraction of the population learn anything from reflection. Everything else consists in the suggestive power of example. After this digression, let us turn back to the problem of sexual interpretation. If we try to define the psychological structure of the religious experience, which saves, heals, and makes whole, the simplest formula we can find would seem to be the following. In religious experience, man comes face to face with a physically overwhelming other. As to the existence of this power, we have only assertions, but no physical or logical proofs. It comes upon man in psychic guise. We cannot explain it as exclusively spiritual, for experience would immediately compel us to retract such a statement, since the vision, according to the psychic disposition of the individual, often assumes the form of sexuality or some other unspiritual impulse. Only something overwhelming, no matter what form of expression it uses, can challenge the whole man and force him to react as a whole. It cannot be proved that such things happen or that they may occur, nor is there any proof that they are anything more than psychic, since the evidence for them rests solely on personal statements and avowals. This, in view of the crass undervaluation of the psyche in our predominantly materialistic and statistical age, sounds like a condemnation of religious experience. Consequently, the average intelligence takes refuge either in unbelief or incredulity, for to it the psyche is no more than a miserable wisp of vapor. Either there are hard and fast facts, or else it is nothing but illusion begotten by repressed sexuality or an overcompensated inferiority complex. As against this, I have urged that the psyche be recognized as having its own peculiar reality. Despite the advances in organic chemistry, we are still very far from being able to explain consciousness as a biochemical process. On the contrary, we have to admit that the chemical laws do not even explain the selective process of food assimilation, let alone the self-regulation and self-preservation of the organism. Whatever the reality of the psyche may be, it seems to coincide with the reality of life, and at the same time to have a connection with the formal laws governing the inorganic world. For the psyche has yet another property, which most of us would rather not admit, namely, that peculiar factor which relativizes space and time, and is now the object of intense parapsychological research. Since the discovery of the empirical unconscious, the psyche and what goes on in it have become a natural fact and are no longer an arbitrary opinion, which they undoubtedly would be if they owed their existence to the caprices of a rootless consciousness. But consciousness, for all its kaleidoscopic mobility, rests, as we know, on the comparatively static, or at least highly conservative foundation of the instincts and their specific forms, in the archetypes. The world in the background proves to be the opponent of consciousness, which, because of its mobility, learning capacity, is often in danger of losing its roots. That is why, since the earliest times, men have felt compelled to perform rites for the purpose of securing the cooperation of the unconscious. In a primitive world, no one reckons without his host. He is constantly mindful of the gods, the spirits, of fate, and the magical qualities of time and place, rightly recognizing that man's solitary will is only a fragment of a total situation. Primitive man's actions have a total character, which civilized man would like to be rid of, as though it were an unnecessary burden. Things seem to go all right without it. The great advantage of this attitude lies in the development of a discriminating consciousness, but it has the almost equally great disadvantage of breaking down man's original wholeness into separate functions which conflict with one another. This loss has made itself increasingly felt in modern times. I need only remind you of Nietzsche's Dionysian experience of a breakthrough, and of that trend in German philosophy whose most obvious symptom is the book by Ludwig Klage's The Spirit as the Adversary of the Soul. Through this fragmentation process, one or other of the functions of consciousness becomes highly differentiated and can then escape the control of the other functions to such an extent that it attains a kind of autonomy, constructing a world of its own into which these other functions are admitted only so far as they can be subjugated to the dominant function. In this way, consciousness loses its balance. If the intellect predominates, then the value judgments of feeling are weakened, and vice versa. Again, if sensation is predominant, intuition is barred, this being the function that pays the least attention to tangible facts. And conversely, a man with an excess of intuition lives in a world of unproven possibilities. A useful result of such developments is specialism, but that also promotes a disagreeable one-sidedness. It is just this capacity for one-sidedness which bids us observe things from one angle only, and if possible to reduce them to a single principle. In psychology, this attitude inevitably leads to explanation in terms of one particular bias. For instance, in a case of marked extroversion, the whole of the psyche is traced back to environmental influences, which in introversion, it is traced back to the hereditary psychophysical disposition and the intellectual and emotional factors that go with it. Both explanations tend to turn the psychic apparatus into a machine. Anyone who tries to be equally fair to both points of view is accused of obscurantism. Yet both of them should be applied even if a series of paradoxical statements is the result. Hence, in order to avoid multiplying the principles of explanation, one of the easily recognizable basic instincts will be preferred at the expense of the others. Nietzsche bases everything on power, Freud on pleasure and its frustration. While in Nietzsche the unconscious can be felt as a factor of some importance, and in Freud became a sine qua non of his theory, though without ever sloughing off the character of being something secondary and nothing but the result of repression. In Adler, the field of vision is narrowed down to a subjective prestige psychology, where the unconscious as a possibly decisive factor disappears from sight altogether. This fate has also overtaken Freud's psychoanalysis as practiced by the second generation. The significant beginnings he made toward a psychology of the unconscious stopped short at a single archetype, that of the Oedipus complex, and were not further developed by the more rigorous of his pupils. The evidence for the sexual instinct is, in the case of an incest complex, so patently obvious that a philosophical limited intelligence could be satisfied with it. The same is true of Adler's subjective will to power. Both views remain caught in an instinctual premise which leaves no room for the other, and so lands us in the specialist cul-de-sac of fragmentary explanation. Freud's pioneer work, on the other hand, gave access to the well-documented history of psychic phenomenology, and this allows us something like a synoptic view of the psyche. The psyche does not express itself merely in the narrow subjective sphere of the individual personality, but over and above that, in collective psychic phenomena of whose existence Freud was aware, at least in principle, as his concept of the superego shows. For the time being, however, method and theory will remain in the hand of the psychiatrist, who of necessity is concerned only with individuals and their urgent personal problems. An investigation of fundamentals involving historical research is naturally not in his line, nor are his scientific training and his practical work of much help to him in getting at the foundations of psychological knowledge. For this reason, even Freud saw himself obliged to skip the admittedly wearisome stage of comparative psychology and press forward into the conjectural and highly uncertain prehistory of the human psyche. In so doing, he lost the ground from under his feet, for he would not let himself be taught by the findings of ethnologists and historians, but transferred the insights he had gained from modern neurotics during consulting hours directly to the broad field of primitive psychology. He did not pay enough attention to the fact that, under certain conditions, there is a shift of emphasis and other psychic dominants come into play. The Freudian school got stuck at the Oedipus motif, i.e. the archetype of incest, and hence their views remained predominantly sexualistic. They failed to recognize that the Oedipus complex is an exclusively masculine affair, that sexuality is not the only possible dominant in the psychic process, and that incest, because it involves the religious instinct, is far more an expression of the latter than the cause of it. I will not mention my own endeavors in this field, since for most people they have remained a book with 7 seals. The sexual hypothesis, nevertheless, possesses considerable power of conviction because it coincides with one of the principal instincts. The same is true of the power hypothesis, which can appeal to instincts that characterize not only the individual, but also political and social movements. A rapprochement between the two standpoints is nowhere in sight, unless we can acknowledge the peculiar nature of the self, which embraces the individual as well as society. As experience shows, the archetypes possess the quality of transgressiveness. They can sometimes manifest themselves in such a way that they seem to belong as much to society as to the individual. They are therefore numinous and contagious in their effects. It is the emotional person who emotionalizes others. In certain cases, this transgressiveness also produces meaningful coincidences, i.e., acausal synchronistic phenomena, such as the results of Rhine's ESP experiments. The instincts are part of the living totality. They are articulated with and subordinate to the whole. Their release as separate entities leads to chaos and nihilism, because it breaks down the unity and totality of the individual and destroys him. It should be the task of psychotherapy, properly understood, to preserve or restore this unity. It cannot be the aim of education to turn out rationalists, materialists, specialists, technicians, and others of the kind who, unconscious of their origins, are precipitated abruptly into the present and contribute to the disorientation and fragmentation of society. By the same token, no psychotherapy can lead to satisfactory results if it confines itself to single aspects only. The temptation to do this is so great, and the danger of loss of instinct so threatening in the breathless tempo of modern civilization, that every expression of instinct must be watched very carefully, since it is part of the total picture and is essential for man's psychic balance. For these reasons, the sexual aspect of the UFOs merits our attention, as it shows that a very powerful instinct like sexuality has its share in the structure of the phenomenon. It is probably no accident that in one of the dreams a feminine symbol appears and in the other a masculine, in accordance with the reports of lens-shaped and cigar-shaped UFOs, for where one appears, we may also expect its partner. The vision is a symbol consisting not only of archetypal forms of thought, but of instinctual elements too, so that it can justly lay claim to be a reality. It is not only historical, but topical and dynamic. Hence it does not appeal only to men's conscious technological fantasies or his philosophical speculations, but strikes deep down into his animal nature. This is what we would expect a genuine symbol to do. It must affect and express the whole man. However unsatisfactory a sexual interpretation may be in this case, the contribution it makes should not be overlooked and must be given due consideration. In the same way the power instinct expresses itself in both dreams. The dreamer appears in a unique situation. She is singled out, indeed chosen, like one whose countenance is burned by the divine fire. Both interpretations, so far as they claim to be exclusive, do away with the symbolic meaning of the dreams and eliminate the individual in favor of the instinctual manifestations. The feebleness of the individual in the face of the overwhelming power of instinct is once more established. For anyone who was not yet aware of this fact, such an interpretation would, of course, be novel and impressive. But our dreamer does not belong to the host of ingenues, but in her case it would be pointless to reduce the dream in this way. She is, on the contrary, one of those moderns who realize what the elimination of the individual means. The paralyzing feeling of nothingness and lostness is compensated by the dreams. She is the only one to withstand the panic and to recognize its cause. It is at her that the unearthly thing points, and on her it leaves the visible traces of its power. She is set apart as one of the elect. Such a gesture on the part of the unconscious naturally has a useful meaning only when feelings of inferiority and the senselessness of a merely functional existence threatens to stifle the personality. This case may serve as a paradigm for the widespread anxiety and insecurity of thoughtful people today, while at the same time revealing the compensating power of the unconscious.